Hi everybody, thank you for joining me here again today at Re-Written Vintage Homestead, the at-work edition. The holidays are over, and so now we're back to our beautiful book, The Dollmaker, and we're on chapter 5. But to recap, chapter 4, Gertie went to visit her parents, and we get to learn a lot about her mom. And her mom is a very needy person for attention, and her dad is very laid back, and he also whittles and carves just like Gertie. But a touching part of that chapter was when Gertie's mom and dad gave her money that was from Henley's crops, and she didn't expect it, but the way her mom acted, that she was so grateful to Gertie for everything that she had done through the years that helped them keep the farm, was very touching to Gertie and made her start questioning her feelings about her mom. Maybe her mom really did love her and not resent her. So anyway, we're on to chapter 5. She was standing by her father's corn crib with a 2-bushel sack of corn on her shoulder. She wanted to load it on Doc, but Doc wouldn't stand for it. Every time she started to throw the corn behind the saddle, he jumped away, and the corn fell to the ground. Henley bent to pick it up. She saw his right hand reaching for it, his blue sleeve rolled up to his elbow, above the big sunburned arm where the dark hairs had bleached a golden brown, and on his finger. But his hand was young-looking, still for 28. The backless rough and brown, the palmless leathery than her own. As she stooped again to reach for the corn, he looked up at her. His hair, dark as her own, but not so straight, had fallen across his forehead. Through it she could see his eyes, dark blue like her father's eyes, more laughing. They had used to be like Cassie's eyes, but not laughing now, sober, serious, asking, "Why? Why do this to me?" And he was both hurt and angry, picking up the sack of corn. He flung it hard across her shoulder, so hard it hurt her neck, and the corn poured out, spilling swiftly to make a golden pile by her feet. Sorrowful, she was staring down at the spilled corn, so sorrowful her insides aching as if the corn had been a wasted pile of yellow gold. And Henley was so mad at her. She wanted to ask him why, but the sack hurt her neck and she couldn't speak. She struggled against the choking weight and reached for it, and she found Clovis's hand, half open, limp in the sleep, the back of it flung like a dead weight across her neck, high up against her throat. She lifted the sleep-heavy hand and laid it back across his chest. All the pieces of reality scattered into nothingness by her sleep drew slowly back toward together. But she lay for a moment longer, fighting to hold on to the dream. Henley was looking at her, and in a moment he would laugh and go riding away with the shelled corn. She lay, her eyes closed, but she could not bring back the shine of the yellow corn or Henley's eyes. They were back there now in her memory with everything else. She rolled out of bed, careful not to waken Clovis. Barefoot and with a long coil of her hair falling down her back, she went to the little window in the end of the loft, so low and so small she must kneel in order to see any sweep of the sky. Yesterday had brought a thin gray rain, changing to sleety snow at twilight, but it was clear now, with no wisp of fog or cloud between her and the stars. The cup of the Big Dipper was getting close to the top of the sky. It was a long time till daylight, not much past 3 in the morning, but she could get up now and have fresh coffee ready for Clovis when he got up. She looked a moment longer at the stars, crouching lower, tipping her head far backwards, sending her glance higher until it searched the ceiling of the world. She lost herself in the thousands and thousands of cold lights, her mind empty as she had slept, so that for an instant she almost recaptured the wondering look in Henry's eyes. A moment more and he would have spoken. Then it was gone, and the lights were stars saying that dawn would come. She tiptoed across the rough, wide plank floor to the stair hole, unconsciously remembering to crouch and not strike her head on the eaves. For even in the center of the loft, she could not stand fully upright. Clovis had complained at times because he and she had slept in the loft. He agreed with her that it was indecent for parents to sleep in the same room as half-grown children. But let the boys sleep up above, he'd say. But Gertie was afraid of fire and the little rattle-trap renter shanty with the kitchen stovepipe going through a hole in the wall. She thought now, as she climbed down the ladder-like stair, how she had told him her fears of the fire, but never a word about the goodness of wakening to stars or the night sound of rain on the shake roof. The children slept in 2 big beds in the main room. She went to the walnut bed in one corner and put one of Cassie's wandering feet back under the covers and took her tightly clutching arm from Clyde's neck, for Clyde often complained that Cassie choked her and kept her awake at night with much overhugging. 3 boys, as always in cold weather, slept fitted together like 3 spoons in the great cherry bed. Reuben was in front to keep the smaller ones from falling to the floor, Enoch next in the warmest spot, and Amos last, his chin on Enoch's neck. She straightened their quilts, and still without striking a light, she went into the kitchen. She shook down the ashes in the great cook stove, her one new piece of furniture, and it a gift from her father. She felt in the corner of the wood box where the fat pine in fine splinters lay and built the fire. Quickly, the top of the stove took on shape and size. The caps were marked by thin circles of red light, while the great openings made 6 squares of light on the wall. The stove light shone on the wash bench of her own making, and on the bottoms of the water buckets. One was of red cedar, made of pieces of wood fitted together barrel fashion and held together with copper bands. It was an old bucket and had, like most of her furniture, which she had not made herself, been a cast-off from her mother's house. Clovis quarreled often at the weight of the cedar bucket and the clumsiness of it, pointing out that a new tin one would cost only a quarter. The children seldom carried it to the spring, but filled it from the smaller buckets. But now, as Gertie broke the thin skim of ice on top and lifted dipperfuls of water from it to fill the coffee pot, she smiled on it, remembering the years she had had it, and was filled for a moment with proud consciousness of ownership. Something solid and old, known and proved long ago by hands other than her own. She smoothed the middle copper band, bright in the stove light from many scrubbings with ashes, and she decided that when she moved to the Tipton Place, she would keep the bucket on the porch shelf and quit using it for water, and instead she would keep her garden truck or meat in it, and her grandmother had used to do. She put the coffee on and stroked the stove afresh, and then, as always in any weather, she picked up the red cedar bucket and went to the spring. She, as usual in clear weather, stopped when she had rounded the house corner and looked at the morning star. It rode high and bright above old John's pines on the ridgetop, seeming hardly the morning star, for as yet no promise of the sun's rising had paled to the east and washed away the smaller stars. Last year, it had in the winter hung in the bare limbs of an old sweet gum by the road gate on Samuel Sexton's place they had rented. The year Cassie was born, she'd never seen it at all. They lived low down on the eastern side of the ridge. There was no whiteness of rock or glimmer of starlight under the pines to mark the craggy path down the ridge side to the spring, but she followed the path with no more thought for her feet than when she would use to cross the kitchen floor. The spring seeped into the hollowed-out sandstone basin at the foot of the low ledge, and without being able to see where stone ended and water began, she squatted by the pool and dipped the bucket in and lifted it and drank easily and soundlessly from the great thick rim, as others might have slipped from a china cup. The water, cold with faint taste of earth and iron and moss and roots and trees, was like other drinks from other springs, the first step upward in the long stairs of the day, Everything before it was night, and everything after it was day. She rinsed the bucket, then drew it up brimming full and went back up the path. Though at the top of the stair-like climb, her breath came slowly and soundlessly as ever. She stopped and shifted the bucket to the other hand, looking straight above her through the pine branches to the stars. Little of the blue-black sky could be seen, and the pine boughs were mixed in with the stars, as if the trees carried stars instead of cones. A pine tree was a pretty thing. They'd let Clovis stay around 3 or 4 weeks before they took him off for good, and with more than enough money to buy a farm. And knowing the army would send her more, she'd buy coal oil and keep the lamp burning. Nights she and Clovis would sit around the stove and she would whittle on a poplar biscuit bowl like she'd been kneading. Around it she would put a ring of pine twigs, and on the side 1 white pine cone. But when Clovis was gone and she settled on the farm, she would work again on the big block of wood. Nights in the firelight. She waited so many years, and now there was no need to wait. She had had her land, as good as had it, and the face was plain, the laughing Christ, a Christ for Henley. So she was so happy, not happy that Clovis might be going off to war, but that she had saved enough money to buy the Tipton Place. Clovis didn't know about it, so he wouldn't have, been spending it anywhere. So she's going to buy it when he goes off to war, and she's already planning on how she's going to decorate and what she's going to make for it. But she's also going to get back to that big chunk of wood that she has that looks like Jesus, has no face. And now she can see in her mind's eye that it's a happy Jesus, because she's happy. She hurried back to the kitchen where the 2 front caps of the stove glowed red. The coffee pot purred and talked to itself, telling itself it was ready to boil. And in the red glow from the stove, the steam rose pinkish white from the tea kettle. She climbed the stair ladder and shook Clovis into wakefulness. "It's time to get up," she said. He roused, shaking his head, and then lifted himself on one elbow, looked across the foot of the bed, searching for the square of light that would mark the loft room window. Seeing only the star-sprinkled sky, he dropped back to the pillow, pulling the covers around him. "God darn it, Gert, it ain't nowhere close to daylight." She drew a deep breath. "It's your army examining day, honey," she said. At that, he was up, for a special bus was taking the men to Cincinnati for their army examination, and it left town at 6:30. She wouldn't sorrow now and be afraid, she told herself. The real army was a little while away, and even then it would only be training. Maybe the fighting would be over before he had to go across the waters. And all the while he was away, there would be dollars every month to build up that Tipton Place. No money would have to go out to keep that old truck running. No half of the crops they raised would have to go to another man for rent. She felt guilty pleasuring herself with such thoughts. And when she scooped her hand into the lard, she took an extra pinch, for Clovis liked his biscuits flaky with lard. She glanced at him as he curved his long, narrow body over the stovetop, shivering, rubbing his hands, and then he stretched with a mighty gaping and reaching up until his fingers touched the sloping cross beams of the lean-to kitchen. "Get your coffee, honey, off the warming oven. It'll warm you up. Then you'd better hurry. It's getting late," she said. "Oh, Law, my woman's wanting to get rid of me," he said, with the same bright-eyed, teasing look she had known when they were a boy and a girl together. He hugged her with both arms about the shoulders, playfully pushing his chin into the back of her neck, jiggling her so that she tipped the wooden mixing bowl until buttermilk sloshed on the table. She jerked one elbow back against him and spoke sharply as she might have to one of the children. "Oh, Clovis, look at what you done made me do. Now get on. You'll get there just when the bus is a-pulling out." His hand slipped from her shoulder, but he stood an instant with his chin pressed against her, like a child's head leaning. "Oh, Gert, lots of time I think you don't love me, nary a bit." The words were the same that he had used many times, but the tone was different. It was less teasing, and it was almost sad. He'd have her blubbering in a minute, making a fool of herself like it down at her mother's. She tried to put a teasing into her voice as she hunched her shoulders to get his chin off, for his breath was dampening the back of her hair. Lord, man, you're a big one to talk about love. Tie me hand and foot in a burning house and have old Uncle Ansel come to tell me his old grist mill was a down again. You'd run off first to see what ailed the mill. Oh, Gert, you're jealous of machinery like it was another woman. He looked about the ramshackle kitchen, his eyes on the bare, rough plank, big cracked floor as he said, I can't much blame ye. For all my machine fixing and coal hauling, it's been pretty poor. He went into the main room to put on the clean overalls she had laid out on the rocking chair, but was back in an instant, shivering and reaching in the wood box for kindling. The young'uns will freeze when they get up. Gertie dumped the dough into the biscuit board and frowned at him. Nope, now, Clovis, there ain't a bit of use of building a fire and awakening the young'uns. But I want to tell them goodbye. But, honey, it ain't like you was going off to war this morning, just the examination. Why, you might not even pass. And if you do, they won't take you right away. If it's too cold in there, put your clothes on here in the kitchen. I won't be a-watching. Clovis did as she directed, but kept glancing toward the room where the children slept. Jim Whittaker, he never got back, he reminded her in a moment. It was just 'cause he didn't want to come back and wait around, she said. He slapped his razor on the strap hanging from a nail by the kitchen door. That waiting won't be no fun, since Uncle Ansel can't get his hands, and hardly nothing of what he needs to run his mind ain't no coal to haul. We've got grub to run us, and we'll get by, Gertie comforted. She felt guilty and tried not to want to tell him of all the money she had saved. She punched out flat rounds of dough and laid them in the bake skillet, shoved the skillet into the oven, turned the sow belly, pushed it to one side of the frying pan, and then got the now partially thawed eggs out of the warming oven and broke them into the hot grease. While the eggs cooked, she tiptoed into the middle room and took from a row of boxes by the inside wall a quart jar of her precious sugar-sweetened preserves. She then took the meat and eggs from the skillet and put in flour for gravy. Clovis wiped his razor, folded it, and frowned, still at his face in the mirror. I look like I'd been shaved with a crosscut saw. Wouldn't it be something now to have it like the people in town, the electric lights and bathrooms? She poured milk out over the brown flour and frowned as she always did when she heard Clovis wish for some of the wonders of going to town. Electric lights and running water won't make an empty belly full, she answered shortly. I'll bet there's many a time Meg would have traded her electric for a week's grub instead, and her man made big money in the mines when he went to work. Meg's seen an easier life than you, he said, sorrow coming back into his voice. No heaving and sweating for you to make corn grown on land that'd be better off left in scrub pine and in briars, and then not keeping all that you raise. Gertie turned sharply away. In another minute, she'd be telling him all about the money she had and how she meant to buy the Tipton Place. Well, then he'd want the money for a bigger and better truck when he got out of the army, like the last time he'd sold her heifer for tires. He might even want to use up all his army pay and quit farming and live in town while he was gone. He ain't been so bad, she said. There's a heap of people that's been worse. I ought to have give up a long time ago and gone to Oak Ridge with Samuel, but you and your mom too, you wouldn't hear of it. But you always said me and the young'uns would have to come too, she reminded him, and I ain't a-wanting to be like Meg, always living from hand to mouth. But she's had it easier, and her young'uns has got good schools, he's insisted, carrying the lamp to the kitchen table. He sat down but did not help himself to food. He looked up at her, his eyes soft, shiny brown in the lamplight. Anyhow, Gert, I always hoped you could have it nicer, and way nicer than Meg. He looked at the plate of eggs and sow belly she put in front of him. You wasn't raised to eat sow belly in some tar paper shack. She poured coffee and set it by his plate. Eat and quit carrying on so, she said. Her voice was hoarse and angry seeming. Our young'uns is learning, she went on in a moment. And anyhow, this settlement couldn't hardly have got along without your tinkering. That grist mill and the mail, I wish to goodness you would quit calling it tinkering, he burst out, a spoonful of gravy lifted above his eggs. In lots of places, people can fix machines as good as I can, makes big money for it. And I'd ought to have gone off and got a job as soon as times got good. Oh, Clovis, she began and stopped. She'd only say the same thing she said so many times already when he looked longingly at some letter from the employment office in town, begging him to go to work in that powder plant in Indiana or Willow Run or some other place. He stirred the biscuit into his egg and gravy. If I'd have gone off to work like I ought to 3 years ago, the army might not be getting me now, and you'd all be a heap of better off. Maybe not, she said. They could have got you anyhow, like they done Millie Neely's man. Left her high and dry in Cincinnati where he'd got a job, and her not getting enough from him in the army to keep her and the young'uns in a town, and nothing back home to come to. You would never have to be a worrying on me and the young'uns, how we're getting along, 'cause I can manage. By doing work fitting for a mule, and the young'uns growing up knowing nothing but work, he said. He took one bite of biscuit and egg and gravy and got up. He picked up his cup of coffee and stood finishing it quickly, and he took the lid from the refilled tea kettle and tested the water. It's hot enough. I don't want it a-boiling. It might crack the radiator, and I got all the holes fresh soldered up just the other day. Gertie was stopping by the oven door, 2 fresh biscuits held tightly between her tough fingers. But you ain't a-going to eat, Clovis? You got plenty of time. I ain't hungry, he said, and he took his coal dust grease-stained mackinaw from the nail behind the kitchen door. You ain't a-coming down with the fever or something, are you? Not eating that away. He looked at her in a hurt surprise. Woman, a body don't go off to be examined for the war every day. I wish you would get the young'uns up. But it ain't like you were leaving for true, she said. Maybe not, he said, buttoning his coat. But all the same, it's something like the ending and the beginning. He crooked one arm and looked at the coat sleeve over it with sharp disgust. Did you wash this thing, Gertie? It looks like a bitch had her pups on it and raised them in there. Well, I tried to, she said apologetically, but it's old and the grease and coal dust won't come out. I wish to goodness I'd have bought me a new jumper, he complained. It's bad enough to go looking like a piece of poor white trash out there, being dirty into the bargain. You'll look just as good as the rest, I bet, she consoled him. Looks ain't everything. He rummaged through his pockets. Oh, Law, I've left my wallet on the dresser. Take this in the spring water and let her be a kind of warming up. Recollect to shut off that petcock I drained her. She took the flashlight from the high shelf and with the water went down to the truck, parked in the middle of the road at the top of the little rise so that the roll down might save cranking the motor. She set the kettle on the ground, knelt to search the petcock, and only then turned on the flashlight, remembering, as she always did, when she saw its jabbing circle of light, how much it had cost and how Clovis was always having to buy batteries for it. Lantern light was cheaper, and she liked it better. She turned the petcock, holding the flashlight between her teeth, and she poured the warmest spring water into the radiator, and then poured a little bit of the hot from the tea kettle, mixing them so that the hot might not crack the metal or the cold freeze. She had emptied both vessels and rushed to the spring and back for more water when Clovis came. As she poured in the last of the water, he gave her a hard, quick hug and a quick kiss that might have touched her lips, had she not at that moment turned her head to see about the radiator cap. He sprang in, twisted together the ignition wires, and then as Gertie jerked out the rocks that wedged the wheels, he stepped on the clutch. She gave a push and the truck rolled away, slowly at first and then faster. She stood, bucket and tea kettle in hand, listening and watching. If it didn't start, she'd have to go help him crank. But when the truck was hardly 3/4 of the way down, she heard the cough and then the shivering roar. Still, she did not turn immediately away, but watched the black shadow of the truck pushing a weak blob of yellow light ahead. She watched it climb to the rise, go along the level space of the ridge crest, turn onto the gravel, and then down again. The black shadow was gone, only the sound was left, smothered by the hill. A lonesome going away sort of sound, different from the noise of the trucks coming home. She shivered, and for the first time she was conscious of the cold. The shivers did not go away completely until she had sat with her feet in the oven door long enough to drink a cup of coffee. She frowned, considering the lamp. The flame was turned down almost to blueness, but still it wasted oil and it smelled up the kitchen, and daylight was yet a long time away. She wished for a churning, some work she could do in the dark, but the cold snap had kept the clabber from souring. Her fingers longingly touched the knife in her pocket. While the children were asleep would be a good time to bring the back of the head out of the block of wood. It would make her feel better, the whittling, and the block of wood would be company. She got up quickly, lighted the lantern, and went off to the barn for the peck or so of corn she had sorted out to shell for hominy. Millions of men were gone in the dark, and their millions of wives couldn't sit idle-handed and wait for daylight. Later, she was glad she had hit upon the hominy making. The work helped keep the children busy and less time for troubling over Clovis. It was hardly daylight before Enoch came running into the kitchen, half awake like a child in a nightmare, crying that his pop had gone off to war and he hadn't kissed him goodbye. He woke the others, and tender-hearted Clyde began to cry, so that Gertie must make a little lie and tell them that Clovis had kissed them all in their sleep before he left. "It ain't like he's going off for true," she told the kids. "He'll be back maybe as early as midnight." Cassie's eyes were doubtful, and she said, "But recollect you told us Uncle Henley he'd be back, and Grandma said he weren't never coming back, never no more till the judgment day, never," she said, staring at her mother with her big pupiled eyes as if her mother's face might hold some answer to this new riddle of never. "But your pop, he'll be all right," Gertie said, her voice loud and insistent. The children left off their crying and their questions, but she could not wipe the doubt from their faces. She was glad when the silent, scantily eaten breakfast was done, and enough daylight had come that she could go do the morning's chores in the barn. There, the cow and the mule and the fattening pig did not know that Clovis was gone. In spite of the clear, sunny weather and the pleasant bustle of hominy making, the children complained much of the length of the day. At noon, only Amos was hungry, and though Gertie quarreled at them for all having eating so much half-raw hominy corn they couldn't eat their proper victuals, she knew it wasn't the skinned hominy corn that filled their bellies, but the same thing that filled her own. More than once through the day, when the shadows of the house seemed fixed on the ground, she thought of the block of wood. Once during the middle of the afternoon, she found herself kneeling by it, knife open in her hand. She sprang up, ashamed of the time-wasting ways, and went back to the hominy corn, bubbling through its last boil in the lard can on the kitchen stove. A pale finger of the low autumn sun had come at last through the kitchen window. She watched it as she stirred the hominy, but so slowly did it whiten, so slowly did it move, and it seemed a dead thing, a differently colored strip of paper pasted on the wall. The band of light gave no brightness to the smoke-grimmed building paper, faded into a dull red, but lay pale and sad, sadder than any sunlight she could ever remember. There was no need, she told herself, to stand and stir the hominy like it was apple butter that was about ready to stick. Seemed like, though, it was the only thing she could think to do. She stirred and stirred and stared at the shelf on the wall behind the stove and at the wash bench by the kitchen door. They looked strange today. They looked different somehow from the way they had looked yesterday. The hominy was through the last boil long before milking and night work time. A moment's terror came down on her as she wondered how she could keep busy until time to go to the barn. She was standing on the porch searching out the children who had gone walnut gathering to the far side of the field when her eyes happened upon the great pile of knotty dead chestnut chunks she and Reuben had sawed last week. Clovis, she remembered, had quarreled when she and the boys had sneaked it up out of old John's woods. Sure, Clovis had complained. The chinchy old skinflint would have given them that for stove wood. If they did wear themselves out and saw it up, nobody could ever split it, he had said. She smiled as she took the single-bladed splitting axe and the heavy white oak maul from their porch corner. Tomorrow morning, she told herself, she'd show Clovis her pile of split wood. She selected what appeared to be a perfectly level spot, picked up an especially knotty 2-foot-wide cut of the dead chestnut and put it there. She lifted an axe and held it in an instant, searching out with her eyes the exact center of the wood. She sent the axe deep into the wood at the chosen spot, and then with one blow of the maul she buried the axe blade. She waited an instant for the crackling sound of splitting wood, and when none came, she took the blunt-edged triangular froe and, holding it with one hand, tapped it into the chunk of wood with the maul, careful to keep the sinking froe in line with the axe. As soon as the froe was firm in the wood, she raised the maul high in both hands and, bending a little, swung it in a high, wide arc, bringing it down with such force that the block of wood sank a little into the earth and the head of the froe flattened somewhat. The children, straggling home with sacks of walnuts, gathered around to watch. Now and then they gave cries of encouragement and always shouts of joy as each chunk came apart. All were troubled, even Clyde, who hated outdoor work, when one of the blocks swallowed both axe and froe and still showed not even a crack. Gertie sent Enoch running for the old iron wedge she used when she made rails to mend a fence. Hardly was it driven halfway in when the chunk gave up and came apart. When the last chunk was quartered, she went to the house for a drink and saw with something close to despair that the house shadow on the eastern side was still a hand's breadth away from the palings of the garden fence. She took her head over the earliness of it, but all the same went on to the barn. There she took heads of cane from the pile in one of the stables and, sitting on the low, long sill, used a length of old cross-cut saw and raked the cane seed down into her apron, dropped sack-like between her outspread legs. The fat hens, gentle as were all her animals, came pecking onto her apron with quickly out-thirsting heads. One, saucier than the others, stood on Gertie's knees and pecked at the head of the cane. "Get away, you feisty girl," she said, and when the hen did not move except to turn her head and look at her, she scolded in mock anger. "I'll bet you didn't lay me an egg today, neither. And eggs is better than 3 cents apiece, little girl." The hen jumped away, and Gertie, looking after her, thought she had spoken unkindly, for with her bright comb, big, wide behind, and neat, slender legs, she looked to be a good layer. She smiled on them when she gathered the eggs, 31 that day. At this rate, she could easily put another $1 in her pocket this week. Another $1? For what? It was still like a sudden awakening from a heavy sleep each time it came to her that she had enough money to buy the land. Dollars now could go for other things like dishes and grass seed, new shoes for Cassie. When she had put in more corn for the fattening pig and listened toward the house to make certain the children were all right, she walked across last year's cornfield. She stopped on the highest knoll to listen to Lizzie's bell. She heard at last the faint faraway tinkle that told her Lizzie had broken through the old fence and gone to the steep wooded banks above the creek. Doc, of course, was with her, for he and Lizzie were great friends, one always lonesome without the other. As she returned from the barn with the brindle, she realized she was singing at the top of her lungs, "I got a home in glory." She checked herself with the guilty wonder of how she could sing on such a day, the day they took Clovis. They would turn him loose for a little while, but he would still be theirs, like a sheep wandering free out on the range, but carrying its own mark in its ear. But if some sheep were marked for slaughter, like Henley, others, like Clovis, would be all right. He'd be safe and cared for in the army. Once he was settled with the land bought and paid for, he'd be glad. He'd be more than glad if she'd saved army wages for the truck. He might quarrel at the 3 miles of dirt road fit for nothing but a sled, but she and the boys would help him fix that. She walked faster. There was inside her another upsurge of singing, even though she kept telling herself that all her fine plans would come to nothing if Uncle John Ballou didn't want to sell the Tipton Place. She plunged down the steep hillside below the field where the land lay north and east. Last night's thin snow still lay in the cup-like hollows of the leaves and the feet of the tall, light, hungry trees. The dark hillside, after the sunny ridge, seemed another world, cold and set forever in a blue twilight. Doc came eagerly up to her and sniffed in her jumper pockets as if looking for corn. Lizzie lifted her head from a clump of fern and watched as Gertie broke a dogwood switch, brittle with the cold. And then, as if she was thinking, the night is cold and the corn and fodder are better than fern, Lizzie turned straight about and went swiftly home. Gertie smiled as she neared the barn and heard Cassie calling, "Good night, son. Good night. I'll see you in the morning. Sleep warm, son." Supper without Clovis seemed more natural than dinner and breakfast. Bad roads, flat tires, long trips had often made him full dark coming home, so that the bigger children often ate supper before he got in, and the little ones were sometimes asleep. The hominy making, the gathering of walnuts, and their other regular chores in the clear, sharp weather had given them all good appetites. Gertie, sitting at the foot of the table with a lard bucket of sweet milk on one side of her, buttermilk on the other, a great platter of hot, smoking cornbread in front, and other bowls and platters easy within reach, was kept busy with filling glasses of milk, buttering bread, and dishing out the new hominy fried in lard and seasoned with sweet milk and black pepper. It was good with the shuck beans, baked sweet potatoes, cucumber pickles, and green tomato ketchup. Gertie served it up with pride, for everything, even the meal and the bread, was the product of her farming. They were just finishing up on molasses and honey when Clyde let out a disgusted cry and sprang away from the table so hastily that her split-bottom chair tipped backward. Cassie, standing between Clyde and Gertie, put her hand over her mouth and looked guilty at her mother. While angry, Clyde cried as she ran for the dish rag, "Cassie, you're the gommonest young'un. You're always a-spilling things. You're half pig." Gertie sighed and pushed the spreading pool of milk along the oilcloth with her knife blade so that it might run to the floor and Jip would get some benefit from it. Enoch quarreled, "You'd slap me, Mom, if I all the time was a-pouring stuff out." "You're bigger than her," Gertie said. "And to all of them, quit measuring your own corn in somebody else's basket." She looked at Cassie, turning away from the table to hide the tears spilling over her cheeks. "Hush your crying, honey. Don't you want some bread and butter and jam? Recollect them wild strawberries we picked back last spring? Well, I've got some of that jam open. Sugar sweetened it is, too." She went for the jar she had opened for Clovis. Since he had not touched it, she had put it back in the press, thinking to save it, maybe, for some Sunday morning when they were all out of flour, with nothing much but cornbread and molasses and butter to eat. The other children fell on the little jar of jam and emptied it in a moment. Only Clyde lingered daintily over the sandwich she had made herself. Cassie's bread and jam that Gertie had fixed and urged upon her lay on her plate, untouched except for one corner scalloped with the marks of her small teeth. Gertie, clearing the table, called Cassie to come and finish it. Instead of an answer, there came from the main room, through the hubbub of the other children, Cassie's voice in a low, elfish laughter. "They took your man off to the wars, Miss Calliloo, clean across the waters, and they'll send him back to you. Always recollect, Miss Callie Lou, they'll send him back to you. Nailed down in a box with nickels on his eyes he'll maybe be, but they'll send him back to you. Don't you be a blubbering and a carrying on, Miss Callie Lou. Clyde, not listening to Cassie, was crying. Mom, you're going to make the lamp explode and holding it sideways that way. Gertie hastily set the lamp she had jerked up back onto the table and quickly turned away, afraid Clyde would notice the fluster in her eyes. Now, Cassie, you've been listening to your old rattle-tongued Aunt Sue Annie, she called, raising her voice in sharpness. You'll be a scaring Callie Lou. Get in here and help Clyde with the dishes. You know how your pop hates to come home to her dirty kitchen. And she went on, looking about for the others. Don't any of you young'uns be a gitter-dumbering and sleepy now. We've got a going and some studying soon's in the kitchen ready. And we'd have a lamp in the middle of the room. Now, Reuben, you build up the fire in the heating stove. No matter how late it is, we don't want your pop getting back to a cold house. It was in the barn where she had gone, as was her custom each night after supper, to take the supper slop to the fattening hog and make certain that all was well for the night. That Gertie stopped in the midst of scolding the pig for wasting his slop to say, I'll buy another lamp with the egg money this week. She pondered, smiling a little at the pig, who looked at her and batted his long eyelashes. 2 lamps will maybe be kind of wasteful, but when the nights is long, and the young'uns, especially Cassie, she needs them. She stood a moment in the barn hall listening. The steady clink, clink of the bell told her that Lizzie was chewing her cud. She heard Doc move in a standing sleep as a hen dream, talking, and she came away sighing a little and wished for sheep. The Tipton Place would be a good place for sheep, and she would start when the money started coming in from the army. She stopped as she crossed the barn lane, and though she told herself that Clovis wouldn't be home until maybe the half light, she listened until even her body, toughened to all the weathers, felt the cold. Back at the house, she heard, as she opened the kitchen door, Enoch's soft but precise voice, briskly sounding words from an old reader Mrs. Hull had loaned them a few days ago. The policeman held up his hand. The children, silence. Then Clyde, her voice dressed up as if she had put on her Sunday clothes and tried to sound like a young teacher, from Lexington for 2 months in the summer before the city school in which was a regular teacher had opened, said, Surely, Clyde, surely, Enoch, you know that word. A little common word like that. More silence. Well, it smiled. Now look at it so that you recollect it. I can recollect the big words a heap beside easier than the little ones, Enoch said before reading again. She heard Reuben's pencil on the old slate and smiled. Her mother had laughed at it, for even when Gertie was little, slates had been out of style. But her father had ordered it from Montgomery Ward, saying a slate was a good thing, since a teacher could, by listening, know if the scholars were working. Gertie brought in the red cellar churn of cream, clabbered now, and Clyde looked up with her finger under a word. Mom, you might want to switch Cassie. We could have a real good school if it weren't for her. She won't even try to read her primer. Look at her. And sure enough, Cassie laid on the sheepskin, one elbow on her neglected primer while she explored Gyp's mouth, her fingers feeling his teeth, even the ones far in the back when he obligingly held open his mouth, smiling on her. He would have clapped his teeth hard on a hand of any of the others could they have managed to get so much of a finger in his mouth. But for Cassie, whether wandering through the woods or lolling in the house, he was ever patient, a smiling friend, even when she would put her bonnet on his head and call him Callie Lou's grandma. Listen, Cassie, Gertie said, you want to grow up ignorant as old Gyp? Now leave him be and get busy with that primer. Cassie understood her mother's voice, and she smiled up at her through her long black lashes. Gertie thought of some bright, wild-eyed woods bird giving her an instant notice before it flitted away. Gyp, Cassie asked, giggling. Where's Gyp? This is a lion. He's about to choke to death on gingerbread. He eats it too fast like Amos, and he's been a-choking, and I've been a-hoping with him. You're all mixed up, Clyde said. with some tartness. "The line I've been reading to you young'uns about is in that old language book, and he had a thorn in his paw." "My lion," said Cassie, "is a choking on gingerbread." "Cassie, you're the biggest idiot. I'll bet Pop, if he wanted to, could draw coffee on you," Clyde said in a breath, and then, realizing what she said, looked at Gertie with shame in her eyes that asked forgiveness. Gertie sighed, but only said, "He that calleth his brother a fool is a danger of hellfire." She turned to Cassie. "Come reading your primer now, and I'll teach you while I churn." Cassie walked to her mother's chair slowly, as if some great pain awaited for her there. The mingled look of shame and guilt and puzzlement that always came when she wrestled with the primer changed her at once into a timid creature who seemed no kid to Cassie of just a moment ago. Gertie turned away from the churn, put one arm about Cassie's waist, pulled her against her knee, and after smoothing her hair out of her eyes, opened the book to the first untorn page. She put a finger under the first word as a signal to begin. Cassie bent very close to the book, then twisted backward again against her mother's arms, peering fixedly at the word while Gertie warned, "Don't get so far away, honey, you can't see." But already Cassie was sing-songing. "Here, Bobby, you can play. You can play with my kitten. Look, Bobby, look." She turned the page, looked at the picture, and then went on with no pause or breath, faster and faster. "Come here, Bobby, come here and see. You can see my kitten. You can play with my kitten. I can play with you too." "That'll do," Gertie said. "Now what's this word?" And she put her finger under play. Cassie frowned and bent forward and studied the word, and then pulled backward, still looking at it. "Ball?" she asked in a low voice, studying Gertie's face more than the word. Enoch giggled, and even Reuben Slate was silent when he listened. Gertie sighed, "Oh, honey, you got to get your whole primer by heart. It's play. Now look at it good till you can recollect it. Now what is this word?" Cassie whispered rapidly to herself and then said in her hesitant, questioning voice, "Come?" "That's right," Gertie said, pulling her closer. "You're going to learn to read good, real good." And she went on, pointing to words. Sometimes after looking at a picture and whispering to herself, Cassie gave the right answer, but more often she did not. Gertie grew more and more conscious of Enoch's jeering giggles and Reuben's disapproving silence and Clyde's brisk attempts at helping. "Mom, maybe if you tried that simple primer that teacher gave us." "We're getting along just fine," Gertie said. But when the child looked up at her, there was such shame and sorrow in her face that Gertie closed the book. She pulled the churn between her knees, smiling meanwhile at Cassie. "You'll learn, honey. You're kindly little yet. Just 5 going on 6. You ain't had no schooling, but you're a-doing fine." "But, Mom, you learned me afore I ever went to school," Enoch interrupted. "If you say another word, I'll get out your daddy's razor strap," Gertie said, and gave the dasher such a hard, quick lick that the clabber squirted out the top. The children stared at her. Their mother almost never threatened a whipping, and when she did, she usually gave it. She took Cassie's hand and felt the cold sweat on her palm. Trying too hard she was, trying harder than any of the others. She would from now on teach her when the rest were not around. Gertie said quickly, "Cassie can count good better than any of you at her age. Clean to 100. Show 'em, Cassie." But Cassie did not begin with her usual gay tripping off of numbers. Instead, she looked at her mother. She was the wise one now, teaching the foolish. "Mom, didn't you know you can't take Pop's razor strap to Enoch? It ain't there no more. This morning, Callie Lou, she was acting up so, jerking my little young'uns out of their beds and playing in the fire and carrying on so, the meanest I ever did see her. So I took her to show her the razor strap. 'Feel it I said. It'll hurt your backsides. I says, and Mommy wasn't there. Poppy done took it clean away. Your pop'll be in about midnight. He ain't. Gertie dropped the lifted churn dasher, pushed back her chair, picked up the lamp, and turned toward the kitchen. It seemed a long way from the chair by the stove to the kitchen wall behind the wash bench. The circle of lamplight moved along with her, black shadows melting in front, and they lowered close at her heels in a tight little huddle, as if the lamplight were a warm thing that could shield them from the coldness of the shadows. She walked close to the wash shelf without stopping, holding the lamp so close to the wall she could see the faint stripe of darker pink where the razor strap had hung for almost a year, while the rest of the once red paper faded still more. She bent and rubbed the brighter strip, her hands more than her eyes forcing her brain to believe the emptiness. Clyde was crying behind her in accusing sobs. Mom, you oughta told us. Mom, you oughta got us up so we could have told him goodbye. Amos looked at his sister and he cried from sympathy. Enoch sniffled, but he sounded happy and satisfied when he said, Pop's gone off to war. None of the young'uns around can make their brags to me no more and say your pop ain't a-helping with the war. Then he, like Clyde, began to sob accusingly. Mom, you oughta have told us we might never see him again no more. Reuben caught his brother by his overall suspenders and shook him until the twigs and dust and weed seeds flew out from under his pant legs. Don't be a-talking that way, don't! And his voice rose, shrilling, until his last don't was almost a wailing cry than a command. You're hurting him, Clyde said, catching Reuben's arm, then looked up at her mother's broad, unmoving back and spoke to it as she said, But Enoch, honey, there's no use to carrying on so, for we all know the war ain't a-wanting Pop, leastways not right away. He's getting kind of old. Maybe he's gone to work a while in one of them factories. Gertie whirled with such a quick fighting swerve of her big body that the forgotten lamp in her hand sputtered and the flame hissed down to a dark blue line so that her voice cried from the darkness, He'd better be off at the war, not in one of those factories. And I wanted to show you guys, this is the first time I have had victory with a Christmas cactus. And look how pretty. And I'm so excited because she's getting some buds and is going to have some new blooms quick. And the reason I think she's doing so good is because I named her Callie Lou, my Christmas cactus, from the book that we're reading, The Dollmaker. Callie Lou, you're just a mean little witch child. Oh, I love her.